Greetings, everybody, and welcome for the second time today. If you were watching my conversation with Tara and Tanya of Morbid Symptoms Media just earlier on today, very interesting discussion there. I recommend you go and watch their channel as well. So tonight we have a couple of things on the agenda, mainly the Russian progress in the special military operation, admissions of total failure by the media with regards to military production levels in the United States, and the progress made by the Chinese government in terms of the pulling together of a unity agreement between the various different political factions that represent the Palestinians. So we're going to be talking about all of that and taking some questions as well. So we'll begin straight away with a overview of what's been going on in the special military operation, which of course has now been going on for 2.5 years. And as the military expert and former Swiss intelligence officer Jacques Beau has said, the Russian focus in the initial period, after it became clear that no deal was going to be forthcoming from the Ukrainians, thanks to the instructions of the US imperialists via their bloated, beetroot-faced errand boy, Boris Johnson. So what has gone on after around about, May to June 2022 was a relentless demilitarization of Ukraine, first of all by destroying their capacity to actually make war, by destroying their industrial capacity, by then destroying their air defense capacity, and forcing the NATO countries into more and more into the role of quartermaster for this entire endeavor, which is something that the NATO countries never fully reckoned with having to do, which is now why they're all panicking and trying to restart various production facilities that haven't been active for years or start new ones. But the more honest picture is slowly emerging. So the Russians have continued with their slow advances, not doing anything that seems from the outside to be too dramatic, but they have been attriting, I think is the military term for it, Ukrainian forces in Donbass and up around Kharkov for quite some time now. And it's causing crisis upon crisis within Ukraine. It's also more than likely contributing towards the political crisis inside the center of US imperialism itself. And the failure of the plans, of which, by the way, Biden has been involved in for many years with regard to Ukraine. The failure of the regime change plan for Russia is part of what is causing the crisis inside the United States, because this was meant to work and they've been planning it for years and it hasn't. So just to look at the battlefield situation, you're now facing a problem in Ukraine if you're an imperialist planner, that not only is Ukraine suffering massive casualties, but even though they are starting to mobilize any man who stands still long enough, and many women as well, that they are severely lacking in trained men, but also lacking in trained officers to lead them, given that you need capable senior officers to do the planning, and you need capable non-commissioned officers to do the battlefield leadership, and they just don't have enough of those anymore. So whereas the Russians aren't doing these big sweeping dramatic moves across the map, they are effectively destroying Ukraine's capacity to continue to fight the war. And I want to pause here by for the purposes of going back over some things we've mentioned before. And I first spoke about this in the audio only version of the old podcast known as Red Star Radio back in the day. Nearly 2 years ago now, I first started talking about this, which is the concept of Ukraine as an outsourced military endeavor for US imperialism and its bloc allies. And if you think about the phenomena of outsourcing for a moment, we've all, I'm sure, worked in organizations or have known of them, worked in either public or private organizations where outsourcing has been a factor. The stage that imperialism is at, of course, promotes outsourcing. It promotes offshoring. It promotes the idea of corporations being as quote unquote lean as possible in order to have as fewer assets as possible, and even not to produce anything themselves, but just lend a brand name to something. I remember a conversation I had many years ago with a senior official in an unnamed public sector organization, meaning it has a name, but I won't name it. The conversation turned its way towards the potential future of such an organization in an era of government cutbacks. This must have been around about 2011, 2012. And this person's answer was to immediately start talking about the needs to be more like Nike, or Nike if you're from the United States. And this was a very big talking point for public sector managers. The idea that there were going to be, in certain organizations, there were going to be brand managers only, which of course, as with many things, as with many developments in modern capitalism, Karl Marx was far ahead of the game in terms of his predicting of this. The capitalists would be seized by a mania which saw them try to turn themselves into not producers of commodities, but the movers around of capital. And from that, you get the idea, they got the idea that they would be managers of brands and that any production will be done by people 3 steps removed from them. So this is a factor in modern capitalism, in modern capitalist development. And therefore, it is also going to be applied to the way in which imperialism operated. The imperialists after the Vietnam War and the devastating defeat dealt to US imperialism by the heroic Vietnamese people in their fight for national liberation and socialism, the defeat of US imperialism and the abolition of armies based on the draft, because the imperialists realized, the British in the early 60s, the American imperialists over a decade later realized that armies built on the draft tend to get rather unstable when wars don't go your way. It is much, much better to have a small or a much smaller professional force that is regarded as being more reliable, because you got an army that comes from the draft system. It is going to be, by necessity, less easy to embed those men and women these days in the military structure. It's going to be less easy to have them subsumed within militarist, imperialist ideology. And it's going to be much less easy to get rid of their connections to the wider masses. And for all those reasons and more, the draft system was slowly abolished all the way across most of the major Western armies. And what was put in its place was the professionalized system, and then that started to shrink as well after the end of the Cold War. But of course, the imperialists had found new ways to manage their hyper-exploitation of the neo-colonial world, relying largely on proxy forces, mercenary outfits, blockades that were sometimes military, but mostly sanctions-based. So smart ways to actually starve a nation or into submission, or to bombard it into submission using a combination of mercenaries or, shall we say, hirelings, including jihadist hirelings, that would fight for you whilst you bombed from the air against countries with little or no air forces or no air defense. And it is in this context that you have to look at the role they had ascribed, or they had given to Ukraine. And this role has become clear from the very early 1990s, where they started flooding Ukraine with emigre organizations coming back over to Ukraine from Canada and the United States, where the exiled fascist organizations have been hiding out since World War II. And they're bringing them back over to Ukraine for the specific purpose of exactly what we see now. The idea was always going to be that Ukraine would be a good place to wrestle away from any Russian influence, to, of course, remove what was one of the most important industrial bases in the former Soviet Union from doing business with Russia, and possibly reconstituting some kind of union state, as the Belarusians have with the Russian Federation. So the idea was remove Ukraine from the Russian orbit and then bring it over to NATO. This, by the way, as we did a program a few months back now on the NATO and Russia engagement in the 1990s. And the agreements are all there on the NATO website. They chronicle how as early as 97, they were striking agreements with the governments in Ukraine that they were going to be on a path to NATO membership. So that's in the Yeltsin era. So we should also bear in mind when we're talking about the Yeltsin era, Yeltsin was a useful frontman and a useful idiot and a crook and a drunk and a degenerate and all of the other adjectives you want to put on him. The man was a scumbag of the lowest kind, a puppet for the comprador bourgeois and the imperialists. But even then, of course, they quite sensibly from their perspective, the imperialist perspective, realized the potential danger of Russia, and working off the plan that was first laid out on paper by Paul Wolfowitz in 1992, they drew their plans to constrain the country, put it under permanent pressure, and possibly break it up. Now, first agreement with Ukraine about potential membership, or a memo issued about it, is 97. That's the same year as the first Union State Treaty between Belarus and the Russian Federation, which is what the Union State between Belarus and Russia is based off of to this day. So it's no coincidence that when the certain forces inside the Russian Federation, even in the Yeltsin period, started pushing towards some kind of Union State Treaty with first Belarus, the idea was floated for Ukraine to be part of that as well. But of course, Leonid Kuchma, the long-time, deeply crooked, reactionary scumbag of a president, was, well, for it and against it at the same time, I think. He always kept his relations with the Russians open, but was always looking to crawl up the US imperialists' arsehole at the same time. So the point I'm making here is that the plans here go back a long way. The plans to utilize Ukraine against the Russian Federation go back a long way, with the ultimate plan to secure a point of pressure to be used against Russia. And then as Yeltsin fell just over a year and a half afterwards, in 1999, with the idea being that as soon as it became clear that the Putin system, or the system that Putin sits at the center of, would be one that was resistant to being essentially colonized and destroyed and run as a semi-colony, basically, of the US. As soon as that became the case, they speeded up their plans for the integration of Ukraine into the NATO system, dangling NATO membership in front of them. But of course, they were never meant to formally join. It was meant to be a lure, so to speak. And the theory that I'm working towards, and I've come to a conclusion regarding my theoretical workings out of this, is that the war we are seeing now, I think, was initially planned to start not 10 years ago, but 20 years ago. If you remember, as I do, all the way back in 2004, with the so-called Orange Revolution against Yanukovych. Again, same forces involved. Yanukovych, just so we're clear, I'm not going to advocate for a second that that guy was anything other than just another variant of a crook. He was just a crook who was slightly more tied to, well, he represented a political party that was based predominantly, but not exclusively, in the east of Ukraine, that ran as a sort of social democratic party. That's what its platform said anyway, party of the regions, but was also in bed with a bunch of Eastern Ukrainian oligarchs. So make of that what you will. But he was somebody who was a potential barrier to this project, precisely because his base was in the industrial working class areas of the east of Ukraine. Though it must also be said that part of the reason why the Party of the Regions was patronized by the Eastern Ukrainian oligarchy was precisely to cut the base of the Communist Party of Ukraine in two. So let's always be clear about what we're talking about here. We're not talking about Yanukovych, the great progressive or anything, but he was a potential barrier to this project. So 2004, the Orange Revolution. And if you, again, recall what was going on then, or if you're too young to remember it, you can quite easily look this up. Lots of the same things went on as went on in 2014. Textbook Keller Revolution stuff, which was, as Putin himself later on correctly observed, Yanukovych won the presidential election. There was a conspiracy going around that Yushchenko had been poisoned, and certainly his appearance changed remarkably. Quite who poisoned him and how is another question. I haven't done enough research to that point to be able to reach a clear conclusion on it. But certainly his appearance radically altered in the days before the election. Now, what happened was, of course, Yanukovych won, but of course the Color Revolution operation that they had been building for over a decade by that stage, think about this, they start building it before the final collapse of the USSR, when the treacherous Gorbachev just abandoned all control and allowed the imperialists to run riot in the country. And they carried on building it for, well, 13 years before the events of 2004. So they were very well established in the country, where they had built up their own cadre operations inside Ukraine, particularly in the west, and they were ready for this trap to be sprung, and spring it they did. Now, what happened was, again, similar things to 2004, hysterical demands of a European future. I remember the news coverage at the time, loads of EU flags being waved in the square in Kiev. The hysterical BBC news coverage screaming that this was the extension of the Velvet Revolutions of 1989. Actually, that wasn't a lie in many respects, but the expectation was clear that this Color Revolution operation was going to deliver the Western imperialists what they desired, which was the candidacy of Yushchenko was going to be successful. Now, if you recall my conversations with Slava of the Chicago Workers' School and now the American Communist Party, you'll recall one of the things that she talked about, I believe in the first time we spoke back in the audio-only days, was about the fact that Yushchenko's wife is actually, I believe, American, from a Ukrainian exiled family. You can kind of guess what kind of family that is, and that Yushchenko was always being run by her as basically a proxy of the United States. And it was Yushchenko who furthered the reintroduction of a lot of the Bandera cult, and clearly was pushing towards what would be then fully realized in 2014. Why I say that I think they wanted the war to kick off much, much earlier, so just after 2004, was because Yushchenko was doing all of this, but he wasn't able to go the whole way. I think opposition inside Ukraine was too big. I think that the imperialists miscalculated somewhat with regard to the forces that were going to oppose them. And eventually Yushchenko got bogged down, though he did do a lot to reintroduce, as I said, the Bandera cult. And also, Putin did some maneuvers on the international stage, went over there, shook hands with Yushchenko, smiled and nodded and said, we want good relations with you. And essentially the Yushchenko presidency petered out. Maybe if he'd have got a second term, some of this stuff would have been heated up. So they learnt from the failure to ignite the war in the East the first time around. Because if you think about it this way, 2004, 2005, 2006, it's when the hysteria about Putin really starts to ratchet up. Again, I can remember this very clearly. I was an undergraduate at the time. I was even doing Soviet and Russian studies. And the annoying liberal dickhead who was our tutor at the time was babbling on about how Putin was a return to the worst of Russia's past, my God. You could see the way it was going in the coverage in the imperialist press was like getting more hysterical. That the great Democrat Yeltsin and his crew had been pushed out. That the evil one Putin had crushed the amazing Democrats in Chechnya, and that he was restoring the Soviet Union, which of course is largely untrue. But what he was doing was making sure, and again, it's never just him. When you're talking about Putin, you're talking about an entire system of which he is essentially the chairman, and which includes, of course, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which has been in an interesting position with regard to the various Putin governments for 20 years now. But in the end, as I've said before, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation and its leader, Gennady Zyuganov, may well be the most influential communist party who aren't actually in government themselves over the last 20 years. And certainly it's the case that the imperialists really turned on Putin after 2001 and after he'd been so nice to them as well. And they turned on him precisely because it became obvious that he was the head of a system which, for whatever contradictions did exist and do exist within it, had reached a consensus point around the fact that they weren't going to allow the nation to be cannibalized and turned into a semi-colony. Remember what Putin said recently to Modi, that the West wanted Russia to get rid of not just its nuclear weapons, but its nuclear power system as well, which, of course, the Soviet Union was one of the world leaders in terms of innovations. So the question of the turn of the imperialists against Putin is quite clear by just examining the history that leads up to 2004. And also bear in mind that their plots against Russia didn't stop when Yeltsin was in power either. The plots are permanent, and it doesn't matter what the President of the United States or the British Prime Ministers say, the plots are always there. And for the reasons that Wolfowitz outlined, you cannot allow a country to exist on the territory of the former Soviet Union with all the natural resources that are at its disposal that could conceivably pose any kind of threat to US hegemony. All said quite openly. And so if they'd have managed to do what they've done now in 2004, and this goes to the point about their plans failing, it might even have worked if they'd have done what they did 10 years later in 2004 and managed to push Ukraine into a civil war in the east, managed to provoke a crisis inside Russia itself. If the Russians dared respond to what was going on in the east of Ukraine, hit them with a load of sanctions, spur on the color revolution in the country, and hope to destabilize the Putin presidency to the point where a palace coup takes place and he's taken out. That, of course, is the plan. Had they managed to do that in 2004, 5, or possibly 6, there's a much bigger chance that they would have succeeded, because the internal Russian comprador bourgeois forces were much stronger 20 years ago than they were in either 2014 or, never mind, 2022. So I think it's reasonable to conclude that they wanted to start this outsourced war of theirs 10 years before it got started. Now, by 2014, they learned the lessons of the Yushchenko failure in that they went much further and in a much more violent and rapid fashion than they had done previously. The use of very heavily militarized Nazi units to assault people. Now, I'm going to have to pause at this stage because I've got a barking dog going crazy downstairs. So just bear with me. I'll be back in. Right, apologies for that. The dog went somewhat crazy. Returning to the point. So the war, had they managed to begin it 10 years earlier, may well have succeeded. 10 years later, they learnt their lessons and went more hard, much more quickly, much more violent, much more assaults being carried out on the Russian population in the east, and they got the war they wanted, but they got it too late. And one of the reasons they got it too late was because their other experiment in Georgia had gone wrong, and also that had strengthened the anti-imperialist forces inside the Russian Federation. And so when it came to 2014, they were taken aback somewhat because the anti-imperialist forces in Russia prevailed and secured the takeover of Crimea, which the local population very much wanted, and the rebellions against the Banderist regime that had been imposed on the Ukrainians by the coup in Kiev. The rebellions there were kept going by a steady stream of official aid, which came in fits and starts, and a lot of unofficial aid, including from the aid convoys organized by the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And it was the communists in the east of Ukraine who were instrumental to the foundation of those rebellions. So the communists in Ukraine and the regions which are now Russia and the Communist Party of the Russian Federation have had a large influence over the way in which this has shaken out. And they have played a very important role in combating the plans of Western imperialism in both Ukraine and Russia. As I say, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation are probably the most influential communist party in the world that is not officially in a government. I say officially because they are very much part of the system that has Putin as its chairman. And again, there's a lot of push and pull in that system. There's a lot of tension in that system, but it is very much a party of influence within that system. And you can tell this just by analyzing Putin's speeches. I've started to look at Putin's speeches the same way I look at Chairman Xi's speeches, which is that you can tell by when you go through them, like the balance of forces inside the political system of Russia, just as you can tell the balance of forces inside the Communist Party of China by looking at Xi's work. And it's especially true if you, as I would advise you all to do, if you have the means to do so, buy the collected editions of Xi's work and go through them, because you can really see in there how the line of the party is representing the various different factions and currents of opinion that exist within the CPC. Very, very interesting thing to read and analyze. I would apply the same thing to Putin. When you read his speeches, when you watch him speak, again, it's not the US-led imperialist bloc and its propaganda. It's always reduced just to the figure of Putin. Putin's speeches are, of course, they're approved by him. He contributes to them, but they're not all written by him, and they represent, again, the balance of forces inside the coalition which he sits at the center of. So this is an interesting thing to do. It's why whenever Putin makes a big speech, I always make a point of reading it, because you can see where the balance of forces lie. And the balance of forces inside the Russian Federation has undoubtedly shifted over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, you look back at the early Putin administrations, you can see a very heavy preponderance of liberals, Russian liberals of the worst kind in there, and the influence of the anti-imperialist factions was, if not minimal, then it was minimized. But it was already being felt. But the pro-market types were very strong in the early Putin administrations. They started to be weakened, though, again, from probably about, if I had to put a date on it, probably from at least from about '08 onwards. A combination of the great collapse of 2007, 2008, which discredited a lot of free market thinking, I think, inside Russia, and also the war of aggression waged by US imperialism via its Georgian proxy, Saakashvili, on Russia via the aggression in South Ossetia. So all of this contributes to a strengthening of anti-imperialist forces inside Russia, and it means that the chances of a color revolution by Western agents and the various comprador forces inside Russia has gone into reverse, because the chances of a pro-Western palace coup spurred on by street-based actions, classic color revolution model, going all the way back to at least Milosevic back in the year 2000. It's one of the first political events that I was cognizant of in a real way. Though, of course, because I was a Trotskyite at the time, and a very young one and a very stupid one, I thought it was amazing. It's only years later you examine the damage and you realize just how wrong you were. So as I said, to return to the point, the war in Ukraine, I think, was meant to start almost 20 years before the special military operation began. So meant to start 2005, perhaps 2006. Had they done it then, they might have been in with a chance of success. Because, again, the power of the compradors in Russia was much stronger. The power of the anti-imperialist section was not as much as it is now. And the overall organization of the Russian state was a lot weaker. All of those factors on the Russian side have improved. And, of course, then what happens after 2014 is that the imperialists themselves start cutting the knees off the comprador faction, because the comprador faction is based on, as in its power is based on, its access to the markets of the West, and its access to the capital, or its ability to move its capital into the West, and its access to the West. Now, if you start to cut all that off, which is what Obama, then Trump, and then Comrade Biden have done, they have put Russia in a situation where they have ended up weakening the very forces that they would have relied upon to carry out a color revolution. To carry out a color revolution, you need an assemblage of the ability to mobilize a large number of people into the streets. By no means the majority of the population, of course. You just need enough, and then you need to be able to put it on the media everywhere to make it look as if, of course, it's even bigger than it is. And to then, of course, have people inside the ruling class who can act as your agents. So like pure compradors, just as there was in Armenia. I'm going to use the unfortunate Armenians as my example here, because they have been used in this way. They've been used in this way by the US and the French imperialists to install Pashinyan. Pashinyan's source of strength is a section of the comprador bourgeoisie in Armenia, but also the compradors in the Armenian exile communities, principally in France and in the United States. And it's no coincidence that the two imperialist powers out of the US-led imperialist bloc that are the most active in Armenia are the US and the French. And those are two of the biggest areas where there's Armenian exile communities, which unfortunately, it would seem that many of them are locked into various things that are run by the US State Department in their countries of origin or in their family's country of origin. But again, to carry out a successful color revolution, you need those organizations on the ground to get people out into the streets. You need a base of operations, basically in the comprador section of the ruling class in that country. And of course, you need the support of the imperialists to help you organize all of this. Slowly but surely, all of these things have been cut off inside Russia. And so by the time 2022 rolls around, the Russians are in a position where, even though they weren't sure that the reforms they put in place would actually pay off for them and enable them to withstand the storm of the sanctions war that was going to be waged upon them, the position of the compradors was weakened. And even though you got these supposedly anti-war demonstrations taking place in St. Petersburg and Moscow, they weren't big enough by any stretch of the imagination to actually worry the government too much. And the other thing, of course, is the consolidation of most of Russian society behind the idea of defending the Donbass and also defeating, ultimately, the Kiev regime, with the Russian population fully understanding, or the bulk of them, fully understanding the idea that this was an assault on the nation carried out by the US, or the US imperialists at the head of a coalition of imperialists. But to return to the idea of outsourcing, Ukraine's outsourced war was meant to essentially not win the day on the battlefield. It was meant to keep Russia frustrated militarily for just long enough for the sanctions war to kick in and work. But because they'd had a long time, almost a decade, in fact, of yes, in fact, it was a decade of sanctions, because the first sanctions went on before 2014. The sanctions started getting put on, I believe, immediately after Putin's re-election as president in 2012. And he came back in after Medvedev had done that term. And this is when Biden, of course, flew over to speak to Putin and told him not to run again. So, yeah, Biden, in the classic manner of which he always operated, often ended up achieving the exact opposite of what he aimed for. So that's Biden, of course, going over there and trying to treat Russia as a semi-colony, which is what Biden regarded it as, or that's what Biden thought its proper place was. So the first sanctions go on after 2012, a few, in response to anti-democratic measures by the evil Putin. This is after, of course, the US had convinced itself, the US imperialists had convinced themselves that Medvedev was going to be their guy. And there was never any evidence of that, not really. He was, in his earlier years, much more typical Russian liberal. That he seems to have shed that particular skin to sort of reinvent himself as the next version of Zhirinovsky. To return to the point about the outsourced war, though, what the Russian way of waging this war what they have worked out is that the US, the British, the French, and the Germans didn't actually have the means to go and fight Russia directly, and never meant to. this outsourcing operation and this very cynical, very brutal usage of the Ukrainian nation by the US imperialist bloc was meant to fight this outsourced war and was not meant to cost them very much, or meant them to cost them only as much as they were prepared to pay in terms of training for the Ukrainian forces, some equipping of the Ukrainian forces, training of special operations units, running of intelligence operations in Ukraine. That was going to be the cost here. It wasn't meant to be that they had to essentially supply the whole operation, which is what they ended up having to do. And so to go back to what the Swiss military expert Jacques Beau has said about all of this, the fact that the Russians identified that they would be able to, first of all, they would need to destroy Ukraine's capacity to produce material for the war after they destroyed as much war material of the Ukrainian side as possible. So destroying all their old Soviet gear, or large amounts of it, and then destroying Ukrainian military industrial capacity, and then destroying the NATO provided equipment as it got deployed to the battlefield. And now we've reached the point where not only can the Europeans not keep up with the demand of the Ukrainian military in terms of replacement equipment, but the US can't either. And there was a very interesting article by on Reuters, of all places, just yesterday. A comrade posted it on the Marx Engels Lenin Institute Telegram discussion, which was about the failure of the US military industrial complex to actually keep up with the required shell production to provide the amount of shells that Ukraine needs. US factories can't deal with it. Why? Because for years, even the much vaunted and talked about US military industrial complex hasn't been investing in new production methods or new technologies for things like shell production. They've been letting a lot of their older skilled workers retire and didn't have any plans around skill retention. They've been essentially minimizing the amount they spend on production. Remember, the first thing they did was they had to tap into a lot of reserves of older shells that they had stored in various places in Europe and in Israel and in South Korea, I think, and send them all to Ukraine. Now they started to upscale production for shells and missiles, and then suddenly you saw a few industrial accidents happen in US armaments factories because they were running the production lines at capacities that they weren't prepared to actually be run at. And so now you're in a place where the full degradation of US capitalism comes into view, US domestic capitalism, because it becomes obvious that despite all the money that has been sunk into the US defense budget, they can't do even quite basic things like keep up with the Russians when it comes to shell production. Well, if they can't keep up with the Russians when it comes to shell production, and again, the Russians are relying upon, of course, the military industrial base that was first started being built up under Stalin, but was expanded significantly in the Brezhnev period. And it is this base that the Russian ability to outproduce the entire NATO bloc, this is where it comes from. But the US now can't outproduce the Russians, can't even get close to outproducing them. And this has now been admitted in a source like Reuters, which is very close to the various intelligence services of both the British and the United States governments. Then you can see that they are clearly having to come to terms with the fact that they have lost this war. They've lost this war. This was meant to be a relatively inexpensive, outsourced operation that would use Ukrainian soldiers to stymie the Russians on the battlefield, hit the Russians with the sanctions, destabilize the Russian economy and thus society, deploy your color revolution assets and hope for a coup. Again, they are at least a decade too late for that, arguably 20 years too late for that. And I think the argument that they wanted this war in 2004 or 5, I mean, that argument is pretty strong, given what we know about their long-term plan for how they were going to use Ukraine to destabilize Russia. So now we are in a place where the various British military chiefs have gone on record as saying we need to vastly expand our military expenditure, or we're going to have a war with Russia in 5 years, which is, again, like ludicrous. Like, the Russians have no interest in conquering Britain. What would they do with us? The idea that the Russians are going to roll all the way across Europe and conquer all of it is like, this is stuff for the fantasies of like rabid Polish nationalists and delusional maniacs of the Baltic comprador bourgeois. But what it does reveal is the fact that their bigger fear is not that the Russians are going to conquer Europe and Britain. Again, that's ludicrous. Their bigger fear is that they've been exposed. And again, to return to one of our favorite areas of the world at the moment, the Sahel countries, that's their action is, well, partially a response to the barbarities of French neocolonialism, but also it's been generated by the fact that the French imperialists have been revealed to be very, very weak, and that they can't beat the Russians, they can't hope to beat them, and therefore the radicalized military officers, radical nationalists in the militaries of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso reached the correct conclusion that now was the time to push forward. And again, imperialism is revealed as a paper tiger. So here we are. The outsourced war has failed. It has generated, or it has helped to generate, a major political crisis in the center of imperialism, the center being, of course, the United States. It is generating crises across Europe, and it has revealed the full degradation and rot of imperialism in its later stage, meaning that their own industrial capacities have withered away due to the fact that they can only export capital and have been degrading their own commodity production ability for many, many years now. And so this is where we are. A complete failure, which will only generate greater and greater crises as time goes on. And we, as communists, of course, must be ready to explain this properly to workers in the imperial core countries when things start to collapse in a more noticeable way. The collapse is already noticeable if you go around certain areas in Britain and also certain areas in the United States. The collapse is already there for a lot of working class areas. But we live in a country, and I'm sure if you're watching this from the United States, this is a situation that is familiar to you as well, that even in the working class there are divisions. There are some areas of the working class in my country where there is still just enough of an illusion of security. This is particularly true of the labor aristocracy. Some of those areas can still just about fool themselves, if they squint hard, that prosperity is still available. The greater and greater numbers of the working class, though, in Britain, and I think the United States too, are becoming very aware that their standard of living is getting worse every year. And we need to be ready to furnish them with an explanation as to why this is happening, as to the effect of imperialism upon them, as to why industry has drained away and withered away, why the economy is becoming more and more parasitic, why the government cannot respond to any of the crises facing the working class, nor would the ruling class ever want to respond to these crises. As the working class becomes more angry and therefore potentially more politicized, the role of communists become ever more important. So it is important for us at this moment to sink as many roots into the working class as we possibly can, to recruit more workers who wish to learn the science of revolution, which is their personified in the Marxist-Leninist worldview, and to be able to bring ourselves to the point where we have at least cadre operations in as many different working class areas as possible. So when things degenerate further, we are ready to act as much as we possibly can to provide explanations and start the serious organization of the working class to actually fight against degenerate late-stage imperialism. Right. I'm going to pause now for questions and comments before we go on to the final bit, or I may put the bit about the Chinese discussion with the Palestinian factions and the agreement they've signed into tomorrow, because it probably deserves its own hour-long discussion. Right, so greetings to Dr. Ahmed, who is with us, President Jesus, who is with us, William Moore, good evening to you. Almir joins us from the once and future Yugoslavia. Potted Rodent is here, as is DE, as is my comrade Beju down in London. Lee, good evening to you. Ken Jack, good evening to you. Gonzalo, hello. Martin joins us from the US of A. And Kawabi is here, as is Martin Milojevic. Sean, good evening to you. Davey, good evening to you. Arnold, hello. And Almir, CNN told you that Ukraine is winning. I think you might want to I would suggest getting your money back, but CNN is free to air because you couldn't pay anybody to watch that shit. Muniz, greetings to you. Brad Wall is here, as is Davud. Hello. Ken asks, how can Russia win with shovels and chips from washing machines? It's easy. You get the shovel. You do it sort of baseball style. You manage to get the shovel. You throw the chip in the air. You bring the shovel through with a good hit on the chip. If you hit it hard enough, you can embed it in somebody's head. That's how you're going to win. Or you can dig for victory as well. DeWitt Wolf is here. Yep, X has paused one video I was doing from earlier to come and watch live. Always appreciate your presence here, comrade. Dr. Fu Manchu says, hello from not my country, the Federal Republic of Germany. Well, best Germany got defeated, but it was only temporary. German socialism will return, comrade. Greetings to Grassy Knoll out in Seattle, Washington, and to Otis. Jenny, good evening to you. Grassy Knoll says, one of Dick Cheney's lasting legacies was the privatization of the US military. Think Halliburton. Yeah, I would see it as a sort of the turning of the US military into a more representative example of late-stage monopoly capitalism, meaning that the US monopolies essentially merged completely with the US military. And the US military became a source of endless profits for US monopoly capital, not just in the sense that the US military is used to storm into other people's countries and brutalize them until they agree to turn over their resources to US imperialism, but also that the contracts with the US military provided like a source of profits to these utterly parasitic monopolies. Same in Britain. They ended up cutting away the effectiveness of their own military forces because of the parasitism of their own system. Interesting case study there in the contradictions of late-stage monopoly capital, destroying the military or helping to destroy the military capacity of imperialism itself. Nikki Const joins us from Athens. Hello to Bruce Albert and to Brad Wall. Hello to Lisa. Madeline Albright, says Grassy Knoll, once said, what's the good of a big military if you don't use it? They use it, but they, of course, use other people's militaries and other mercenary-type organizations far more because, again, what's Mao's quote about imperialism being a paper tiger all about? The fundamentals that he identifies there, the fundamental point he identifies there, is that imperialism has an incredibly weak connection with the masses. The Vietnam War revealed that. The Iraq War revealed it again to a degree. And the reason why they don't do a draft and still won't do one is because they're afraid of what will happen if they did. Hugh says it's important to feel sorry for the families, communities and workers who have had everything destroyed by this war and all wars before and the ones soon to start. It's important to draw from Hugh's point. It's important to remember that the primary sufferers from this are Ukrainian workers. They are, there's many Russians dying in this war as well, but it's the Ukrainian working class who never, for the most part, voted for this to happen. They voted consistently for the party that they fought, the parties that they thought would secure peace and a sort of co-development space with Russia. No, none of them wanted, or very few of them wanted, the horror that was to come. But unfortunately, that was something that was inflicted upon them by the Ukrainian ruling class, who sold their country quite literally to US, British, French, German, and Dutch imperialism. But yes, Hugh's point is well taken. Almir's point is correct in that the imperialists tried, first of all, to destroy Ukraine and rip it out of the Soviet Union by assisting the Banderite war after 1945, from 45 to 52, I believe. I've read bits of Adam Tooze's Wages of Destruction. It's got some quite useful information in it to answer Escadista's point. And Almir said, yes, you can argue that the imperialist attempts to destabilize the USSR via Ukraine were going on as early as the 1930s, and in which a certain Mr. Leon Trotsky was playing an active role. Read his articles of the late 1930s. It's very clear what he's calling for there. He's calling for the breakup of the USSR and the removal of not just Western Ukraine, but all of Ukraine from it. Go and look at it. It's all on the Marxist Internet Archive. Articles by Trotsky on Ukraine in 39. There's at least 3 of them. You can read them on there. All very clear. And the fact that he was so clear about wanting to take Ukraine out of the Soviet Union, or for Ukraine to exit the Soviet Union, caused a revolt even amongst his own followers, because they were looking at it as so crazy and reactionary. Ronan Gould says, weren't the Western press and capitalists initially quite fond of Putin? It's an interesting question to look at, that one. He got an easier ride in the first couple of years because they weren't really sure how he was going to be. So he was on TV here quite a bit in the early period. There's a very famous, rather softball interview that he got with David Frost, the late Sir David Frost, of Frost-Nixon fame. But even then, like, he's having to explain where the line is with regard to the expansion of NATO. So even then, the elements within the Russian system that were vehemently opposed to NATO expansion were making their presence felt. And so that Putin, even in his more pro-Western days, as he has addressed in recent speeches, was forced to say that in interviews quite openly. So yes, early on, they thought they could string him along like a sort of Yeltsin figure. But as time went on, it became obvious that he wasn't a Yeltsin figure. And he was, and I think some in the West do understand that he's at the head of a coalition, which is why they seek to destabilize it. But they're so, their propaganda is so dumb these days, and they think that we're so dumb. They seek to boil it all down to the idea of Putin as the sort of reincarnated Tsar. That's why there's so much focus on him. It's easier to demonize an individual than it is a system, basically, if you're a bourgeois propagandist. And yes, G8 was never a real thing. It was the G7 plus Russia, and it was designed basically to give Yeltsin a prize that meant nothing, essentially. Yes, and Hugh notes that G7, with the G7 plus 1, Russia was always a guest. Martin says, I wonder if part of Western imperialism's miscalculation in the Yushchenko era was the underestimation of the extent to which the Western left would fall in line behind Banderism. I think that they were pretty clear. Maybe not, actually. I mean, it's an interesting question to ask, because I can remember even a decade ago, when the coup happened, even the old Communist Party of Britain back then was running articles in the Morning Star here as to like the fascist component of that coup. They were actually talking about it. And there were people that allowed space in the Communist Party of Britain, by the way, not my party, but the faded, tattered remnant of the old Communist Party of Great Britain. long story as to what happened to that. I won't tell it now, but I may in the future if there's a demand for me to do so. They have gone relentlessly to the right and become more and more opportunist as time went on. They used to have some decent people in them who would make anti-imperialist points. They were even 10 years ago. But I think the Western left has degenerated even further than it was degenerate 20 years ago. Like and again, let's go back to basics. The ruling ideas of any period are the ideas of the ruling class. And the Western left is based in academia, bourgeois academia, trade union bureaucracy, and other more typically upper working class labor aristocracy and petty bourgeois professions. And the power of the working class in our country or in the United States has been low for a long time. Therefore, because of the left's social base, the only influences that it absorbs are really from the ruling class. And so the left degenerating even further between 2004 and 2014 and then 2022 is a representative sample of this process. You can see this process unfolding if you look at the positions of the left. In 2004, even The Guardian was running a couple of guest editorials from people who were opposing the Orange Revolution. Yes, the bulk of their editorial content was still pro-Yushchenko, but there were a couple of dissenting pieces allowed in there. There were some even allowed in 2014. 2022, none. Rest of the left, of like the so-called Marxist left, that is pro-imperialist, so not Marxist at all in reality. 2022, all uniformly declaring the war to be an imperialist war, either on Russia's part or as an inter-imperialist war between Russia and the United States. Now, at the time, and again, in the interest of full disclosure, in the early period of that war, when I had a brief flurry of doing YouTube videos and stopped for a while longer, I echoed some of this in 2022, and you can go back and you can see that. The videos are still up there. But I never fell into the trap, I'm quite happy to say, of declaring it an imperialist war on Russia's part, not fully. And then it was the special military operation launching and the influence of other factors as well that finally pushed me fully to embrace Marxism-Leninism. So thanks, Putin, for that one. But yes, Martin's point is an interesting one. And I think we have to go back to the fact that the Western left, its primary influence is the ruling class, the ruling ideas of the ruling class. It has no influence within it from the working class whatsoever. The class content of the Western left is almost entirely bourgeois and petty bourgeois. And in terms of the petty bourgeois in Britain, their primary influence is, well, the bourgeois. Because again, where you have no powerful proletariat, where the proletariat is disempowered and atomized, as it has been over the last 4 decades, really, 5 decades now, again, the influence on the petty bourgeois radicals largely comes from the bourgeois. So, like, the petty bourgeois radicals become ever more deranged because the only influence on them comes from the ruling class, and ever more pro-imperialist as well, of course. Hello to the comrades from Midwestern Marx who greet us on behalf of the American Communist Party and Midwestern Marx. Good to have you here, comrades. Congratulations on the very successful launch of the new party, or I should more accurately say, the reconstitution of an American Communist Party. And congratulations on the hysterical response as well from all the right people. I don't think you could have asked for better advertising. Moving onwards. Where are we now? Ken Jack says, isn't it fair to say if Putin was a politician in the West, he would be a conservative? It's a very difficult comparison to make, Ken, because if Putin, once you understand the system that Putin sits at the center of, it's hard to compare him to anybody in the West, because I mean you can make the argument that the politicians in the West have certain similarities in that they sit at the nominally, but not really, at the head of ruling class coalitions. But because the Putin system, as the KPRF have correctly said, is a Bonapartist system, it sits above the classes to an extent. You can't really compare him to anybody inside the imperialist countries because we simply don't have that same system here. Putin can, and indeed has done, in various different stages, tell various oligarchs how to behave. Now, there's the famous example of him carpeting Deripaska. You could not imagine any Western leader, any US president, post Nixon, or even before then, really, ever talking to, like, publicly talking to their, like a Fortune 500 CEO. Could you imagine, in fact, any US president after Roosevelt, really, ever talking to a Fortune 500 CEO in the way that Putin spoke to Deripaska, publicly humiliating him? Yeah, he didn't take all his money away, but he essentially forced him to keep a factory open that was going to close otherwise, because again, Putin and the Putin system identified it as crucial for the sovereignty of the Russian state that such a factory remained open. And I couldn't imagine a British Prime Minister doing that, because the system is simply not built that way. Our political leaders are, yes, authoritarian, bureaucratic, but they're not really in charge. They're actors to a large degree. They are the nominal heads of systems which are very heavily bureaucratized and are, of course, largely merged with the operations of monopoly capital. The Russian system is different. The Russian system sits above the classes, and therefore it is able to, when it is required to, issue directions to even the Russian capitalist class and to actually take action that goes against the interests of certain sections of the Russian capitalist class. And again, I could not imagine that happening here. In fact, I am certain that it would not, because that is just not how the system here is built. So this is a rather long-winded way of addressing Ken's question, because if you'd have asked me that a year ago, I'd have agreed with you. But I think the more accurate way to look at it is that there just simply isn't an analog to Putin in the West, nor could there be. Not at this stage. Not unless some form of relatively progressive Bonapartism emerges, and that could only emerge in response to the collapse of imperialism in France or Germany or Britain or the United States. So again, it's not a comparison that's actually easy to make. In Russian terms, what is it fair to say that Putin is a conservative? Probably not, because a conservative is, in political terms, somebody who's a reactionary. The real conservatives in Russia are the brain-dead reactionaries who wish to go back to the glorious 1990s, or who wish to restore some sort of fantasy concept of feudalism in Russia. Putin is, he wouldn't thank me for saying something like this, but in actual fact, the system he runs has overall been a progressive system in that, and here I'm going to use the actual meaning of the term progressive, not the bastardized cartoon that it's come to represent in the United States and Britain, in that he has genuinely progressed Russian society. He has overseen some real improvements in terms of solidifying the sovereignty of Russia and actually restoring a certain degree of incomes, restoring incomes and restoring stability for the bulk of the Russian population. In those senses, he's been a broadly progressive president. not in the sense that Russian communists would have liked to have seen, not in the sense that were I Russian, I would have liked to have seen, but overall, he's been a progressive president. Again, that's not a term that I think he or his allies would thank us for applying to him, but in the real sense of the word, Putin is a progressive. He's a Russian progressive in alliance with, in an increasingly important alliance with forces such as the Russian Communist Party. DeWitt Wolf says, I was a right-wing reactionary in 2000. Not sure if that's better or worse than being a trot. It's probably about the same, mate. Given that in 2000, I was in favor of like a color revolution in Serbia. I was in favor of like, I was all over the place on the potential Western intervention against Iraq. I was like anti-worker in some respects with regard to my own social position. Had all kinds of anti-social beliefs and practices about drug consumption and drink consumption. So as to whether you as a right-wing reactionary 24 years ago would have been any worse than me, we'd have probably been about the same. In truth. Midwestern Marx says, hard to carry out a color revolution when Western-backed NGOs have been banned, including those using LGBTQ as a weapon of imperialism. Yes, and it was entirely the correct decision to ban all those NGOs and clean those bastards out of there. And again, same. Go back to our discussion of Lukashenko the other day. It was entirely the correct decision that he took to dispose of the NGOs and push them out. And if the Georgian Dream leadership, which is, again, it's a Georgian bourgeois party, but if they succeed in actually clamping down on Western NGO operations, it will be a victory for Georgian sovereignty. And if the Georgians manage to reach a permanent and lasting settlement with the frozen conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia and manage to rebuild relations properly with the Russians, it will all be to the benefit of the Georgians themselves. I wish the Armenians well in hopefully one day soon disposing of the rat Pashinyan, but it doesn't look good at the moment, I must be honest about that. Good morning to Chris Olesen, who joins us from Osaka. Hello to you, comrade. Yes, Hugh says, Putin, Medvedev and Lavrov confirmed in many speeches G8 was a lie. Russia was treated as a guest, not a member. As Tony Blair himself said when it came to Russia, and this was leaked out in papers released by WikiLeaks, I think, the thing with Russia is to treat them as if they are a great power, even though they're not. That was Blair's strategy. They knew very well what they were doing. They were pandering, but it was content-free. Make them feel important to make sure that they stay within Western-controlled systems. Almir says, most important Russian allies and friends today are socialist countries. Yes, which will hopefully strengthen the position of socialism inside the Russian Federation and those fighting for it. Morgan says, Armenia is a tragic case. Thousands of young men allowed to die bravely by a ruling clique that cared nothing for them and continues to spit on their graves. Yes, again, I will reiterate my profound hope that the Armenian people can bring down the Pashinyan clique and also chase the US influence out of there. It's no coincidence that the US has one of its biggest embassies in the world, I think, in Yerevan. Again, like the Armenian governments over many years allowed that to build up. They should never have allowed it to get that far. I mean, we might have to get. I'm going to try and get the interviewee I had on before a while ago back on to talk about Armenia, but they should never have allowed that color revolution base to build up in their country, because this is just what happens. They employ, because they've got an almost unlimited budget, they can employ thousands of people on inflated salaries to act as their political organizers on the ground and have those people essentially plunge your country into a death spiral. And then run away when things hit when the shit hits the fan. Deep Titanic asked if there's any reading recommendations on Armenia. Good question. I will make a note of it and try and find some. Almir says, Andrei Martyanov on his channel said that Russia, the worries now about demilitarizing NATO. Western industries hollowed out and unable to replace material losses. That's all true. Russia, could return to the Western imperialists with those treaties they had for signing, they wanted signing or they wanted to negotiate about in 2021, late 2021, and say, this is how you end the war, agree to this. Be interesting to see. Hey, well, here's a wild hope. If Donald Trump does 1/100th of what the liberals in the United States fear that he will do, if he actually, whether it's even if it's just by pure pettiness and spite, that he accidentally destroys NATO, then after the revolution, we'll put a gold statue up of him as an inadvertent hero. Just scrolling through comments here. Yes, Ken's point is well taken. They actually fought the West imperialists thought the Russian army was crap, and they did appear to believe that to a degree. I'm not sure that they ever believed it was quite as weak as their propaganda said it was, but they certainly believed that they could hold it up and stymie it. And that would give enough time for their sanctions to work. And none of this worked out for them. Hugh says Ukraine has been hollowed out by NATO and the EU, not Russia. But let's not forget the role, and I'm sure you didn't mean to neglect this, of the Ukrainian ruling class. It is, again, one of our favorite words on this channel, comprador. It is a comprador ruling class, and always has been. The Ukrainian ruling class were compradors in the pre-Russian Revolution period, when they emerged out of the chaos of the later period of World War I. There were compradors in the 1930s. They're compradors during the restoration of capitalism, and they're compradors now. They completely destroyed their own country, sold it off piece by piece to BlackRock and Vanguard, and now they condemn the entire Ukrainian working class to go and march off and die horrifically so they can preserve their own parasitic experience. There is not a description too harsh for these people, or a punishment too harsh either. Right. Mr. Chopin says, I'm convinced the US ruling class is so deluded they see everything as if it is a comic book. Some of them, undoubtedly. Frank asks, if not today, please explain the China attack on Vietnam in the late 70s. Caleb Maupin blamed the Gang of Four. No. The Gang of Four were already out of power, and I think they'd been arrested by 1979, which is when that war took place. So I'm not quite sure how you can blame the Gang of Four when they were already arrested and facing trial. So I think it's deeper than that, as you say in your question, Frank. But I would need to look into it. So let me make a note of it, and I'll come back to it in a future stream. YepX asks, have you done a discussion on various universal basic services such as housing, education, healthcare, etc., and how they would work in practice, especially here in the States? I haven't, but it will be an interesting thing to do. I think there's been a discussion amongst like social democrats in Britain, I think in the United States too, about things like universal basic income and stuff like that. Again, like these things are impossible to implement in a progressive way under capitalism. You can't do it. You can't do progressive UBI under this phase of late stage imperialism. It's just not possible to do. What you'd end up with is something like what we've got here, which is a so-called reform of the benefit system, which ends up essentially turning the benefit system into a low-wage supplement system. So not possible to do under capitalism, but worthy of a discussion of how guaranteed housing, education, etc. would work under socialism. I will make a note of it and come back to it. Martin says, I'm from Denmark and I'm absolutely furious at the current leaders of my government. are supporting the US proxy war in Ukraine. Russia is not the enemy of Denmark nor Europe. Same goes for China. Martin's point is entirely correct. Hen Knapp asks, newish to watching your streams and a member of the WPB myself. Did you do a dedicated stream about the WPB or on Galloway, his previous win in Rochdale? I did talk about it. I would need to go back and find where that was, because that was that back in May? Back in May, wasn't it? If I find it, I'll repost it on the Telegram group. But keep we're coming to the close of this particular stream for tonight in a minute. So keep your question, Hen Nap. Bring it back another night, and when I've got more time, I'll address it. Tony Mack says, any analysis of the migrant issue? Did a whole immigration special a few weeks back. It's on the live section of the YouTube page. You can find it on there. If you want to go and watch that, then come back with questions. Maybe we could handle this on the Q&A. GDR DDR says the pronoun brigade have been triggered by the American Communist Party. They say the new party is cis-normative. Yes, well, God forbid that a party actually seek to resemble the class that it actually wants to lead. You know, I saw some dickhead, and you always get this moaning about the fact that the DPR in the DPRK, all the leaders are very smartly dressed, and that looks a bit fascist. You know, because to be a real leftist, you've got to look as if you just fell out of bed following a nasty night on some very high-strength weed, and look like you haven't washed in about 2 weeks, and you look like the kind of person that like somebody would actively cross the street to avoid. Yeah, because that's what the left in the United States and Britain has become, a sort of refuge for people who are either too weird for society or who aspire to be too weird for society. And so, I'm not exactly coming to you. I haven't got the tie on tonight, but one of the reasons why I cleaned my own act up in many respects was because you realize that, if we aspire to be the tribunes of the people, to use an old phrase from Lenin, then you have to clean your fucking act up. You have to look serious and behave seriously. It's one of the lessons, actually, that, to be fair, was that Caleb Maupin quite successfully drummed home in some of the early streams I saw him do. And he was right about that. For too long, like so-called Marxists have looked like carnival freaks and behaved like them as well. And therefore, one should be serious. One should dress as well as one can. One shouldn't appear to be or take pride in being an imbecile. And one should value presenting yourself well and being healthy mentally and physically and in an all-around way, if you possibly can. Of course, there are people who have conditions, real conditions and real illnesses, and, communist parties should make allowances for that so these people could be properly involved. But there's a difference between making allowances for people who suffer from various disadvantages in life, whose contribution should still be valued, and then being a home for the antisocial, the weird, the fucked up, and the degenerated. There's a line there that needs to be drawn. You should not say power above classes. The true Marxists will blame you for being revisionist. They stick to the dogma, won't accept such a thing. Well, that is the classic definition of Bonapartism, though. Yes, there's progressive Bonapartism and reactionary Bonapartism. So, like, the original Bonapartism that Marx is describing comes from the era of the Louis Napoleon era, the era of the reconstituted empire, around about 1850 to 1870, 1871. And that period was a reactionary Bonapartist period, but there's been different forms of Bonapartism. The form of Bonapartism that Putin is at the center of has ended up becoming a progressive one, with the Russian state becoming more and more able to dictate terms when it needs to members of the capitalist class. Again, that's not something that can be denied because it can be verified by research into the actions of the Putin-led administrations. So it's not something that we've just made up to suit a theory that we've pulled out of our asses. It's based on a study of what the Putin system has developed into and how it's interacted with the Russian ruling class. And again, like the KPRF is saying constantly that the government goes nowhere near far enough, and that the ability of the Russian bourgeois to move their capital into Western Europe and the United States was in the end cut off by Comrade Trump and Comrade Biden, who put capital controls on Russia in a much more aggressive fashion than Putin was prepared to. But again, like, it's still the case that the Russian state is able to engage in economic directives and give directives to the bourgeois in a way that would not have been the case under Yeltsin. And the Yeltsin regime, by the way, was a Bonapartist regime too. It was from 93 onwards, following what's known as the Black October. And Putin inherited the same constitution, the Yeltsin constitution, and the same powers that the US warmly approved of Yeltsin having, and used them to much better effect in the end. So again, it's a progressive form of Bonapartism. It's a form of Bonapartism which, again, is not a case of the state being directed by the interests of the monopoly capitalist. That's not how the Russian system is constituted. And therefore, that's another part of the reason why to call it imperialist is completely and utterly wrong. And again, a misusage of the term imperialism. Almir asks, is Russian military industry entirely state-owned? And if not, are private companies ordered around by the state? Yeah, the bulk of it is state-controlled. There are private sector elements in there, but the Russian state forms and implements the defense plan, and the private elements of the military-industrial complex have to deliver upon it. They are directed as to what to do, which is why it's much more efficient than the American version. GDR says, progressive in the West means urinals in women's bathrooms. That's about the size of it, yes. Therefore, historically, Putin is better than Franklin Roosevelt. You know, it's a difficult comparison to make, Frank. It's difficult because, like, these are such different systems in different countries operating at radically different times. But I mean, you could make the argument that there are certain comparisons between a Roosevelt and Putin, but again, that would be something I would need to spend a lot more time talking about. Hugh asks, do you think Scotland can change? If so, how? Scotland can change the way the rest of Britain can change by overthrowing the ruling class. That's how, not just Scotland, but that's the only way we can really change the entire country. You can't change Scotland in isolation from England and Wales, just like you can't change England in isolation from Wales and Scotland. We would have to change this entire island of ours, and the only way to change that is to overthrow the power of the British ruling class, to destroy British imperialism and rebuild the whole country on the basis of a planned economy run by and for workers. That's the way we'll do it, run by the dictatorship of the proletariat. There's no other way around this. There's no reform possible. There's no clever formulation that some of the middle-class leftists think that they've found that's going to get us out of this situation. We are in a situation where it is going to be a straight-up case of us or them. Us, the working class, them, the ruling class. That's the fight that we're moving towards in Scotland, England, and Wales. What are the chances of a Cold War II? Well, we're already in it, Beiju, to answer your question. Sounds like it's something for another stream, to be honest. But yeah, with Cold War II already begun. I think that begun quite some time ago. At least, if I wanted to put a date on it, I'd say 2012. Right, scrolling down. Here. Rista Kostadinov says, it is honestly hilarious how the Russian capitalists are forced to invest in Russia now that the European American markets are closed to them. And China is really not that easy to speculate in China. Good point. So, okay. I'm going to draw things to a close for this evening because it's hit the midnight hour over here and I need to be up early in the morning. So thank you to all 299 of you who have tuned in tonight. And I will be back again with you tomorrow. Stand by later on this week for the Patreon-only episode on the Oliver Stone movies, JFK and Nixon. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and on Buy Me a Coffee. Your support makes all of this possible. I will be back again with you later tomorrow. Please join me then. But until then, good night to all and solidarity.